In this painting, envoys from various countries paying tribute to the Qing court, we can see Emperor Qianlong receiving congratulations in the Forbidden City on Spring Festival. In it, court officials can be seen waiting outside the Hall of Supreme Harmony, while the emperor sits under the eaves of a hall in the inner palace before venturing forth to receive the foreign envoys. This painting was executed by court painters according to the instructions of the emperor, and so the detail of the Russian envoy holding a clock was accurate. During the reign of Emperor Qianlong, the thing that most represented Western advanced techniques, and which was therefore the most craved gadget in the Forbidden City, was the clock. It was not only used as a timepiece, but also as an ornamental object. It was a luxuriant plaything and a fine work of art at the same time, and the imperial court went to great efforts to search for, collect, and even make clocks. When today's people admire these magnificent clocks, they might not realize that more than 400 years ago, clocks were the objects that made it possible for the first Westerners to enter the Forbidden City. Matteo Ricci was an Italian missionary who, in 1601, the 29th year of the reign of Emperor Wanli, became the first Westerner to enter the Forbidden City. Matteo Ricci had come to the capital of the Ming Empire dressed as a traditional Chinese scholar so he could get close to China's scholar-bureaucrat class. He had but one aim: to spread Catholicism in China. In the 15th and 16th centuries, geographical discoveries and the opening of sea routes between the East and the West kindled the enthusiasm of Catholic missionaries to work among the Asians. And so, from the mid-16th century, European missionaries began to come to China. However, Confucianism had taken root in China well over 2,000 years before, and in the 2 millennia that followed, Chinese concepts, mindsets, and modes of conduct had been entirely shaped by Confucianism. Chinese society found Catholicism alien and unacceptable. Matteo Ricci, however, had learned from some of the hard and necessary lessons experienced by his predecessors, and so his approach was to make flattering comments about Chinese culture while at the same time using Western mechanical products such as clocks to attract China's scholar-bureaucrat class. And as it happened, it was a strategy that did help him in his missionary work, and many people came to him to discuss scholarly matters. One of them was Xu Guangqi, a famous individual in the history of Chinese science. Matteo Ricci believed that if the Chinese people were to be converted to Catholicism, efforts should first be made to convert the highest ruler of China, the emperor, and after this, the power of the emperor could be used to influence the subjects. If he wanted to convince the emperor, obviously he had to first meet the emperor in person, and the only chance for a foreigner to be received by the emperor was to present him with articles of tribute. Matteo Ricci had more than 40 articles of tribute given to Emperor Wanli, and these included chiming clocks, a crucifix, a Madonna, a music box, and 2 glass triangular prisms. While Ma Tang, the director of taxes in Tianjin, reported to the emperor on the article of tribute presented by Ricci, the content of his memo apparently did not attract the attention of the emperor. But the emperor did fall in love with the 2 chiming clocks and summoned Matteo Ricci to the palace and asked him to tune them, And so, because the emperor was keen to hear the chiming of a clock, Ricci entered the Forbidden City. In an encyclopedic book compiled by Grand Secretary Zhang Tingyu and a number of other officials, there is a note stating that the big chime clock struck once at 1 o'clock, twice at 2 o'clock, and 12 times at midnight and at noon, while the small chime clock struck once every 15 minutes and struck 4 times when it was on the hour. Inside the clock case were gears that kept the clock working, although these movements could not be seen from the outside. Emperor Wan Li permitted Matteo Ricci to stay in the capital, since this meant he would be able to come to the palace to test the clocks whenever required. Ricci spent 3 days teaching the eunuchs the mechanical principles of the chime clocks. As Emperor Wan Li had not held court for a long time, Ricci had no chance to talk about Catholicism with the emperor. He could only pay respects to the throne along with court officials at the Grand Assembly. But in return for the clocks Ricci had given him, Emperor Wan Li allowed Ricci to build a Catholic church in the southern part of Beijing. "400 years have since passed, and today the two chime clocks are nowhere to be found, but in Beijing, at Administration College, the tomb of Matteo Ricci has been well preserved. On May 3, 1610, Matteo Ricci died of illness and was buried here. Thanks to the two clocks, this Western missionary had been permitted to regularly enter the imperial palace for 10 years, but in all that time, he never once had the opportunity to see the emperor in person." In 1640, one of the articles of tribute presented to Emperor Wan Li by Matteo Ricci 40 years before was found in the warehouse in the Forbidden City. A harpsichord now covered with dust, but Emperor Wan Li's grandson, Emperor Chongzhen, was seeing this harpsichord for the first time. Probably in order to overcome his feelings of loneliness in the palace, or perhaps simply out of curiosity, Emperor Chongzhen wanted to listen to Western music. And so, in 1623, a German missionary by the name of Johann Adam Schall von Bell was summoned to the palace to repair his harpsichord with its silver strings. In order to expose Emperor Chongzhen to Catholicism, Johann von Bell translated 10 psalms from the Bible into Chinese, set them to music himself, and then presented the pieces to the emperor. And then later that same year, the German missionary submitted a memorial to the throne in an attempt to persuade the emperor to become a Catholic. This is German missionary Johann Adam Schall von Bell, the man who tried to convert a Chinese emperor to Catholicism. In 1629, Zhu Guanqi, who had discussed scholastic issues with Matteo Ricci, had not only become a great scientist, but also a Catholic. Moreover, he had been appointed vice minister of the Board of Rites. On June 21st of the same year, there was a solar eclipse, but officials of the Imperial Board of Astronomy had failed to predict it. Zhu Guanqi, on the other hand, had predicted it with calculation methods used in Western astronomy. Emperor Chongzhen responded by ordering the setting up of the Bureau of Calendar and appointed Zhu Guanqi its chief. For the first time, Westerners, namely Western missionaries, were employed to help formulate a new calendar in China, and after that, the books on Western astronomical calendars were translated into Chinese in a systematic way. But by the time the 130-volume Chongshen calendar was completed, and before it had been promulgated, the Ming dynasty had already been overthrown by Li Zicheng's rebellion troops. In old China, astronomical phenomena were regarded as indications of the fate of a dynasty, and so people tended to pay more attention to them when there was about to be a change in power. In 1644, the Ming dynasty was replaced by the Qing dynasty, and so Johann Adam Schall von Bell gave Chongshen's calendar a new name. It was now called A New Calendar Based on Western Astronomy, and he presented it to Dwar Arghun, the Prince Regent. Dwar Arghun accepted it and promulgated it with yet another new title, the Shixian calendar. And this calendar remained in use until the end of the Qing dynasty. In a memo to Emperor Xuanzhi, Johann von Bell explained the nature of astronomical phenomena and persuaded the ruler to adopt a Western calendar and have new instruments made for calculating and observing astronomical phenomena. In the first year of the reign of Emperor Xuanzhi, von Bell made a new sundial using a compass to set the sundial's north and south markers. In a sundial, people can tell not only the local solar time, but also the solar period by looking at the direction of the shadow cast by the arch in the center of the sundial. This is a telescope made by the palace's Office of Manufacturer in the early Qing dynasty. Johann von Bell had earlier presented a Western-made telescope to the Prince Regent so he could be allowed to stay in Beijing. The celestial globe is one of the oldest astronomical instruments in the Qing Imperial Palace. Johann von Bell had won the favor of the new regime. After the death of the powerful Prince Regent, Emperor Xuanzhi took over all the power, and although he was a devotee of Buddhism, he kept good relations with Johann von Bell. Before his death in 1661 at the age of 24, he had appointed Kangxi as a successor, a proposal in which Johann von Bell had played an important role. Emperor Kangxi was only a young boy when he ascended the throne, and the real power lay in the hands of a selected group of grand ministers who were headed by Bai, and before long evidence of power struggles could be found everywhere. Johann von Bell, then in the Directorate of Astronomy, became caught up in one such power struggle. With support from Bai, a number of officials in the Imperial Board of Astronomy, who were dissatisfied with the Western calendar, successfully accused Johann von Bell of conspiracy, and he was put in prison. Emperor Kangxi intervened, and Johann von Bell was spared the death penalty. But he was already an infirm old man, and he died soon after his release. But Emperor Kangxi took power, and Johann von Bell's reputation was restored, and he was buried beside Matteo Ricci. In 1669, at the Meridian Gate, a showdown was in the making, and the key person in this confrontation was Ferdinand Verbiest, a Belgian missionary who had been Johann von Bell's assistant. His adversary was the Directorate of Astronomy, headed by Bai. The Directorate of Astronomy had made mistakes in calculating the calendar using traditional methods, and 15-year-old Emperor Kangxi took this as an opportunity to deal Bai a blow. He ordered officials from the Imperial Board of Astronomy and Ferdinand Verbiest to go to the Meridian Gate and measure the sun's shadow at noon. It turned out that the calculation Ferdinand Verbiest came up with was correct, while that acquired by traditional methods was quite wrong. Ferdinand Verbiest had helped Emperor Kangxi win an important victory over Bai. and the emperor placed him in full charge of the Imperial Board of Astronomy. The site of the Calendar Bureau, where Johann von Bell and Ferdinand Verbiest once worked, is located near the Beijing Observatory. Ferdinand Verbiest made 6 instruments for celestial observation, and these are still retained in the ancient observatory, now one of Beijing's historic attractions. This chamber music sonata was composed for Emperor Kanchi by Theodoricus Pedrini, an Italian missionary, and it is fortunate that some manuscripts of these pieces have been found. According to historical records in 1670, Emperor Kanchi ordered all the missionaries who could play musical instruments in Beijing to play for him, and so, with considerable haste, these Westerners formed an orchestra. Unfortunately, since the performers had no time to practice adequately, the result was dire, and Emperor Kanchi quickly expelled them from the imperial palace. However, Emperor Kanchi had become interested in Western music, and a few days later, he summoned the chamber group to perform for him again. This time, the concert went on for 4 hours, and Emperor Kanchi was so pleased that he tried some of the instruments himself. Matteo Ripa, an Italian priest who served the imperial court, wrote in his memoirs that Emperor Kanchi wished to be both a mathematician and a musician, and that although he did not have attainments in either field, he nevertheless liked them very much. Pedrini, therefore, composed some sonatas for the emperor, and under his guidance a monograph of music theory entitled Annotations on Music was produced. Pedrini's sonatas were the first pieces of European music to be introduced to China. Emperor Kanchi spoke highly of the musician Theodoricus Pedrini and listened to him playing many times, and he also sent some students to learn from Pedrini, and among them were 2 princes. Emperor Kanchi longed for knowledge all his life, and the ardent interest he showed in Western mathematics, physics, and chemistry was the result of that contest over calendars he experienced in his youth. He told his ministers, "If I don't have understanding, how can I judge who is right and who is wrong? So I have to learn as much as possible." By this time, European countries had established associations and societies of sciences, and these had an impact on Emperor Kanchi, who established similar institutions at the imperial court to train scholars in mathematics and physics. On November 28, 1688, Emperor Kanchi received 6 French scientists, including Joachim Bouvet and Jean-François Gabion. They presented the emperor with 30 scientific instruments and a number of books as gifts, and the emperor was delighted. He asked them to serve as his advisors on science, and this was the beginning of decades in which foreign scientists work in the Qing court. This horizontal equinoctial universal dial from England, a device that was commonly used in navigation, can measure time by the hour and minute, as well as the height between the sun and the ground. Ferdinand Verbiest was in charge of the Imperial Board of Astronomy from the 8th year of the reign of Emperor Kangxi, and at the same time was the emperor's first teacher in mathematics, astronomy, and mechanics. Joachim Bouvet and his fellow countrymen got along very well with Emperor Kangxi, so much so that Bouvet wrote in his biography of Chinese Emperor Kangxi the following: "The emperor learned Western science with great interest. He spent several hours with us every day, and he spent more time on self-study." This hand-calculating machine was made by the imperial court during the reign of Emperor Kangxi, just a few decades later than similar machines were made elsewhere in the world. Emperor Kangxi's interest in science and technology was such that he used this logarithmic table. Naturally, his interest in science and technology greatly boosted the development in science and technology during this period. He even sponsored a series of scientific and technological events. This instrument, made by the Office of Manufacture, was used by Emperor Kangxi in his study of astronomical mathematics. This horizontal semicircle sundial was also made by the Office of Manufacture. These silver tools were used to prepare medicine in the Qing court, a court that had an emperor with a sound knowledge of medicine. At the age of 40, Emperor Kangxi had contracted malaria, and his Chinese physicians had not known how to treat it. After taking quinine presented to him by missionaries, however, he had quickly recovered. As a result, the emperor became interested in Western medicine and set up a lab in the palace where medicines were made on a trial basis. He even ordered that a bear in hibernation be used for the study of anatomy, and he took part in the experiments himself. These instruments were used for geographical surveys in the reign of Emperor Kangxi. According to Joachim Bouvet's biography of Chinese Emperor Kangxi, the emperor himself would adjust the instruments, do the calculations, and then ask others to check the results. When his calculations were the same as those of the others, he was delighted. This is a part of Guangdong province in the Imperial Universal Geographic Map. Emperor Kangxi directed the survey in person using advanced techniques such as geodesic triangulation, and it was the first map of China to indicate exact latitude and longitude. This was one of the instruments used in the making of maps. In the late 17th century and early 18th century, at a time when nationwide surveys in European countries had not begun, or were only in the very early stages, China was mapping its entire territory on an unprecedented scale. In one decade during the reign of Emperor Kangxi, a working team comprising both Westerners and Chinese worked together to create a complete map of the Qing Empire's vast territory. In the meantime, the country had become unified and stable, and China entered a new flourishing age. In 2005, an exhibition titled Louis XIV, the Sun King Versailles Treasures Special Exhibition opened at the Meridian Gate as response to the Emperor Kangxi exhibition held in Versailles Palace in France in January 2004. In letters to Kangxi, Louis XIV called him the most distinguished, the most brilliant, the strongest, and the noblest emperor, and he put such adjectives as profound, devoted, and sincere friend before signing his own name. This was the image of Emperor Kangxi in the mind of the French people. During Emperor Kangxi's time, culture exchanges between the West and China were frequent. In his palace, the emperor set up studios for painters and sculptors and established workshops for making clocks and producing colored enamels in the office of manufacturer. This painting on a screen entitled Maids in the Shade of the Tong Tree is one of the oldest oil paintings in China. It was executed by a court painter after he learned oil painting techniques from a Western missionary. It was at this time that a Chinese culture fever appeared in Europe. A number of Western thinkers of the Enlightenment movement, including Voltaire in France and Leibniz in Germany, found a spiritual weapon in traditional Chinese culture which could be used in the fight against the theological teachings of the Middle Ages. Leibniz even discovered the principle of modern computers in the Book of Changes. Throughout the 18th century, almost every aspect of Western arts was influenced by Chinese art, with Chinese decoration styles becoming very popular among European aristocrats. Many of them decorated their manners in Chinese style and even had Chinese scenes painted on their walls. The era of Emperor Qianlong witnessed another climax in cultural exchange between the West and China. During the reign of Emperor Qianlong, this picture album of Yuan Mian Garden was drawn. Early in the 18th century, Emperor Qianlong asked Michel Benoit, a French missionary, to build this group of Western-style buildings. The Lodge for Retired Life, a quiet spot in the garden of the Palace of Peace and Longevity, was built by Emperor Qianlong for himself after he retired from the throne, and inside it were exquisite interior decorations and fine furniture. Here, Western perspective and Chinese paintings and decorative techniques were subtly combined, and the lodge showed the influence of Western culture that had come about during the emperor's reign. The Western-style buildings were not only appreciated by Emperor Qianlong, but also they were used as models by his ministers and the nobility. In several paintings for birthday celebrations executed in the Qing dynasty, we can see Western-style buildings. Missionaries had come to China bringing with them Western science and arts, and while their original intention of undertaking missionary work was gradually forgotten by the Chinese people, the culture they had brought had a widespread impact in China. In 1714, when 7 missionaries arrived in Guangzhou aboard a commercial ship, the local government submitted a memo to Emperor Kangxi. He ordered that those missionaries who had scientific skills be brought to Beijing, but those who didn't be sent back to their home countries. But among those who stayed was Giuseppe Castillon, a painter. This is the memo written by the governor Guangdong reporting the arrival of the missionaries, and it bears comments in the handwriting of Emperor Kangxi. And so Giuseppe Castillon went to Beijing and presented himself before Emperor Kangxi, who was so impressed by his painting talents that he asked him to learn Chinese painting. For 50 years, Castillon served as a court painter under the reign of 3 emperors. This is the portrait of Emperor Yongzheng in Western clothes painted by Giuseppe Castillon. After Emperor Yongzheng ascended the throne, Giuseppe Castiglione was placed in even more important positions. In order to cater to the taste of the emperor, he changed the Western oil painting techniques he used and incorporated traditional Chinese aesthetical concepts to create new words and new styles by using Chinese painting materials. Emperor Qianlong commented as follows on the portrait of himself and Emperor Yongzheng painted by Castiglione. Giuseppe Castiglione is good at portraying people, and he portrayed me in my childhood. These foreign painters could not just paint as they wished, of course. Almost all paintings by Castiglione were carried out according to the emperor's direct instructions. Most of Castiglione's paintings were about the emperor's achievements. Between the 20th year and the 26th year of the reign of Emperor Qianlong, two Zhongguo rebellions were put down by the imperial court. In order to commemorate the successful suppression of the Zhongguo rebellions, Emperor Qianlong asked his foreign painters to create works based on the event, and then the paintings were sent to Europe and made into engravings. 16 paintings were sent to France, where 7 of the best engravers made the engravings in work that lasted for 7 years. In the 38th year of the reign of Emperor Qianlong, 200 dry points along with the original paintings and copper plates were shipped back to China. The whole process lasted for 11 years, but the emperor was satisfied with the result. This painting, entitled Envoys at the Qing Imperial Court and executed according to Emperor Qianlong's instructions, shows ambassadors from 27 countries having close ties with China. In September 2004, the Hall of Clocks in the Palace Museum was moved from the Hall of Preserving Harmony to the newly renovated Hall for the Worship of Ancestors, which were used to be the ancestral temple where emperors of the Qing dynasty made offerings to their ancestors. The nearly 200 clocks and watches of the Qing court on display in this hall are beautiful in form and feature impressive craftsmanship. They represent the highest level of clockmaking in the world during the 18th century to the beginning of the 20th century. Mechanical clocks were first made in China in the late Ming Dynasty, but clockmaking thrived during the reign of Emperor Kangxi, who had an office established to make and repair clocks. In Guangzhou, Fuzhou, and some other cities on the middle and lower reaches of the Yangtze River, such as Nanjing, Suzhou, and Yangzhou, clockmaking became popular. These clocks were made by the Office of Manufacturer of the Qing court during the reign of Emperor Qianlong. Some clockmakers served inside the Forbidden City. Guangzhou was the only port open to foreign trade in the Qing dynasty, and it was also the non-governmental center of mechanical clockmaking. Clocks made in Guangzhou usually took the shape of a gourd, a symbol of good luck. Bright-colored enamels were widely used to decorate the clocks. In the middle of the Qing dynasty, the number of scientific instruments in the imperial palace decreased, while that of mechanical clocks and toys increased due to the personal taste of Emperor Qianlong. Clocks were used to keep time, play music, and simply be present as ornamental objects. Foreign countries made clocks as articles of tribute to Emperor Qianlong to cater to his tastes. Clock with a man writing, the biggest toy clock in the imperial palace, is 231 centimeters high. A figure on the base can be seen writing Chinese characters, which means His Majesty's influence reaches in all directions and people pay respects to him from all over the land. As the figure writes, his head moves from left to right, and according to records, the idea of a Westerner writing Chinese characters with a brush pen came from Emperor Qianlong himself. Emperor Qianlong loved this clock and took it with him to his new dwelling place after he retired from the throne. This gold-plated copper clock with an elephant-drawn chariot depicts British troops marching to the battlefield. The trunk, tail, and eyes of the elephant can move, and the wheels can roll. In fact, it can display so many tricks that people often forget it's a timepiece at all. The 18th century saw great advances in science and technology in Europe, where machine making was coming to the fore, particularly in England, where the best clocks were being made. The Qing court had accumulated huge wealth over its 100-odd years, and Emperor Qianlong used much of them to buy clocks from England. All the halls of the Forbidden City had English clocks, and so the clocks from England became articles in hot demand from imperial relatives, the nobility, and ministers. Zhao Liang, a member of the imperial family, made this comment: "The chime clocks made by Westerners are wonderful. Almost all the officials have chime clocks in their house as a plaything." Foreign trade was growing, and the channels of exchange between China and the West were greatly expanding, creating conditions suitable for the introduction of science and technology from Europe. The personal preference of Kangxi and other Qing emperors promoted the introduction of Western objects into the imperial court, but they were treated more as playthings than scientific achievements. So although Western clocks were placed in almost every corner of the Forbidden City, they did not keep the empire abreast with progress in Western countries. Today, these clocks are displayed in the Hall of Ancestral Worship, where they were once worshipped along with the ancestors of the emperors of the Qing dynasty. In the late Qing dynasty, some new scientific inventions from the West, such as the electric light and telephone, were introduced into the Forbidden City. Even Western-styled food and entertainment passed through its gates. All of these enriched the life of the emperor, but just as with his attitude to clocks, the master of the palace treated the modern achievements of civilization as simply objects of amusement. Western powers, on the other hand, were using these achievements to build warships and cannons, which were to be used to force China to open its doors. For a time, the Forbidden City became an exhibition hall of Western articles of tribute and a crimson-walled cage of advanced science and technology in which many accomplished craftsmen were confined. Today, as this first piece of Western music ever introduced into China is played in the Forbidden City, it is an era in which exchange and development have become the most popular tune. And certainly, stories about people and events over a period of several hundred years in the Forbidden City can give us answers to some of the mysteries of history.